Well, hello there. I just got back from Newfoundland and thought I'd tell you a story because I've got this video figured out thanks to Troy St. Louis. And I was the Canadian press correspondent for 2.5 years and based in St. John's with a young family. Starting back in 1985, we arrived in January 1985. And in April, the Tory Premier of the day, Brian Peckford, called a snap election, a 3-week campaign. I spent 2 weeks with him and 1 week with his opposition, Liberal leader Leo Barry, who was a lawyer who'd made his name with the Ocean Ranger families. He'd represented many of them. And he wasn't much of a politician, but Peckford certainly was. Peckford had the gift of oratory, as so many Newfoundland politicians do. And I'd say that Peckford was probably one of the great ones. And that's saying something because this is the land of Joey Smallwood and John Crosby and many, many others that I really don't know much about. But for the first 2 weeks of that campaign, it was my introduction to Newfoundland, really. It was at the end of a long winter. And we traveled around by helicopter and flitting from outport to outport to every little nook and cranny of the province of Newfoundland. It was fantastic. And there were Peckford gave pretty much the same speech in every little place. He'd toss a dime on a stage, and in his best Newfoundland accent, he'd point to that dime and he'd say, "You see that dime?" He'd say, "That's Hibernia," he'd say. "And all of this belongs to us." And he'd sweep his hand across the stage around him. And he got a lot of traction with that speech. Now one day we got into a car, not a helicopter, and we drove up a gravel road up the Great Northern Peninsula to a little outport, and I can't remember the name of it, but we pulled in. Brian Peckford and his assistant and myself, and there were other reporters there, obviously. And it was a Saturday afternoon, I think. We went to a high school gymnasium, and he started to give his speech, but they wouldn't let him talk. People were upset about the road, and they were yelling and carrying on, and they wanted a paved road. It was the only way in and out of the Great Northern Peninsula. And finally Peckford said, "Okay," he said, "I won't give my speech, I'll take questions. Just keep it orderly and line up." And they did. I think Peckford was a school teacher, and he kept pretty good order. And people lined up and they asked questions, and it went on for more than an hour, and I think he won himself a few votes that day. He had a good day anyway. And meanwhile, so a week later, I came into the same outport, this time by helicopter, with Brian Tobin and Leo Barry. And I mentioned on the ride in that I'd been there with Peckford the week before. And they said, "Oh, how'd that go?" I said, "Well, you know, he opened the floor to questions. It worked out pretty well." "Oh," they said, "you know." So we landed, the helicopter landed on I think it was probably a soccer pitch next to a community hall. There were dogs and kids and everything running around. It was crazy. Went into this absolutely jam-packed, tiny little community hall. There were people sat down. There were people standing up, leaning on posts, up against walls, hanging through doorways. And Tobin and Barry and the local riding president and the local candidate all sat at a head table. And Leo Barry said, "You know what?" He said, I'm not gonna give a speech today. I'm gonna take questions. I'm gonna open the floor to questions." He'd never done this before, at least while I was covering him. First question, guy stood up and he says, "You fixed the nomination, didn't you?" Local candidate said, "Did not." And the guy says, did too. The other candidate says, did not. And the guy, the questioner, said, you're a liar. This woman shot up in the audience and says, my son's no liar. And her teeth came flying out of her mouth, clattered on the floor. Brian Tobin, Leo Barry got up, motioned for the door, and we all got out of there. It was a fracas, it was fisticuffs, it was absolutely crazy. Piled into the helicopter, took off. It was an evacuation. And that was my introduction to Newfoundland politics. It was a colorful, colorful place. And I absolutely loved my time there. There were a lot of great stories and wonderful people. That was 1985, Stephen Thorne.